He entered probate court claiming $1.8 million with a handwritten letter until the judge read the entire thing aloud. Gerald walked into probate court with a handwritten letter and $800,000 worth of certainty, and the judge read that letter out loud, every word, including the part Gerald had not thought about. My name is Eleanor. I was married to Richard for 22 years, and I need to tell you what that means, or at least what it meant to me, to know the specific sound of his footsteps on the stairs, to be able to tell from the way he poured his coffee whether he had slept or not, to have built a life that is not one grand thing, but 1,000 small, real ones, stacked up carefully over time until they become the whole of something, and then to have someone you barely trusted while that person was alive walk into a courthouse and try to take a piece of it with a piece of paper. We met in 1999 at a professional conference neither of us particularly wanted to attend, and by the end of the second day, I had decided he was the most quietly interesting person in the room. He asked if I wanted to get coffee away from the conference hotel and find somewhere that served actual food, and I said yes, and that was the beginning of it. We were married in the spring of 2002, small ceremony, people we actually loved. I wore a dress I had partly made myself, altered from one my mother had kept in a garment bag since 1971. Richard cried a little when he saw me come down the aisle. He was not a man who cried easily, not in public, not in front of people, but he cried that morning, just enough that I noticed, and I have never forgotten it. That was the day the photograph was taken, the one on my dressing table, the one with Gerald visible in the background, already holding a drink, already watching from the edges of someone else's happiness. If you have ever been treated like your patience meant permission, stay with me. And if this story speaks to you, subscribe to my channel for more stories like this because quiet women are not always powerless. We were not a flashy couple. We did not talk about money at dinner parties. We lived in a house we had chosen carefully, in a neighborhood we watched grow around us over the years, and we raised two children who learned early that showing up and being steady was worth more than almost anything else. Richard's business, the commercial real estate partnership he and two colleagues had spent the better part of 2 decades building from almost nothing, was the result of that same steadiness. Not inherited, not given, earned carefully over time. Richard was a man who documented things. He had good attorneys, and he used them properly. His will had been in order for years before he got sick, reviewed and updated as circumstances changed, because he was not the kind of person who left important details to chance. The partnership agreement was specific. His estate plan was specific. He understood that love and care expressed only in conversation evaporate when the person who spoke them is no longer in the room. I did not fully understand at the time how much that would matter. Gerald was Richard's younger brother by 5 years. They were not close in the way some brothers are. They had the kind of relationship held together by history and obligation rather than genuine warmth. Richard was loyal to his family, sometimes more than they deserved. He had helped Gerald out of financial trouble more than once, quietly, without keeping a running score, because that was Richard's way. He was generous in a way that does not announce itself. Gerald had what I would call a selective relationship with memory. He remembered every favor he had ever done and seemed to forget entirely those he had received. He was charming in rooms full of people who did not know him well. He could be difficult in rooms where he could not control what people were thinking of him. I had spent 22 years being polite to him at holiday tables and family gatherings, sitting beside him when Richard wanted to include him, and keeping my actual opinion entirely to myself. Richard knew what I thought. He did not ask me to change it. He just asked me to be kind, and I was. I believe I was. The framed wedding photograph sat on my dressing table through all of those years. Sometimes in the morning, I would look at it while getting ready, and I would see Gerald in the background, that same quality about him even then. A man watching from the edges of something that was not his, waiting for his turn at a table that had not invited him. Richard was diagnosed in the fall of his 63rd year. It came quickly, and it was serious. We spent the months after rearranging everything we thought we knew about time. He was clear-headed until near the end, which was both a mercy and its own kind of difficulty. We talked more in those months than people in long marriages often get the chance to. We said things we had always meant and never said because there had always seemed to be more time. I remember one particular evening, maybe 2 months after the diagnosis, when we were sitting together at the kitchen table after the children had gone home. The house was quiet and the tea had gone cold, and Richard had his hands around the mug anyway. He told me he was not worried about leaving me. He said it plainly, the way he said everything important. He said he had made sure that everything was documented and clear, and that I would be protected, and that the only thing he was sorry about was that there was going to be paperwork during a time when I deserved to be left in peace. I told him not to worry about the paperwork. He said, "I know you. You will handle it. That is not what I mean. I mean, you deserve better than having to think about any of it." I have thought about that conversation many times since. His affairs were already in order. His estate had been structured carefully, reviewed by Patricia, his attorney, within the last 2 years. The partnership agreement addressed the transfer of equity clearly. His will was witnessed, notarized, and filed. There was nothing left undone, not because death was anticipated specifically, but because Richard simply did not leave important things undone. That was who he was. What Richard did not anticipate was his brother appearing in the gap between grief and paperwork. The first thing I noticed happened before Richard was even gone. His name was Carl, and he was the partnership's accountant, a man Richard had trusted for 15 years. Carl called me on an ordinary afternoon, perhaps 6 weeks before Richard died, and his voice had the particular careful quality of a person who is not sure exactly how much to say. He told me that Gerald had been calling him, not once. Several times over the course of a few weeks, Gerald was asking questions about the partnership structure, the distribution percentages, what happened to a partner's equity share upon death. Carl said he had not answered those questions. He had told Gerald those matters would be handled through proper legal channels. But he felt I should know. I thanked Carl. I wrote it down. I wrote down the date, his name, what he had told me, and the number of calls he said Gerald had made. That was the first thing I folded into the envelope. I want you to sit with what that means for a moment. Richard was still alive. He was still in our house, in the room down the hall where I had arranged the light to come in soft in the afternoons because he liked that. We were still in the middle of the hardest chapter of our lives together, and Gerald was already calling the accountant, already asking about numbers, already positioning himself for whatever he had decided he deserved. I did not tell Richard. There was nothing he could have done with that information, and there was no reason to give him more to carry, but I kept it. I have a very good memory for things that matter. Richard died on a Tuesday in late February. The service was small, the way he would have wanted. I stood in that church with our children beside me, and I thought about every ordinary Tuesday we had spent together over 22 years. The way he drank his coffee standing up at the kitchen counter, the particular sound of him coming through the back door, the way he always somehow knew when I was tired before I had said a word. Those were the things I carried out of that church. Not the grand gestures or the significant moments, the small, reliable, ordinary things. Gerald was at the funeral. He was composed and appropriate. He shook my hand at the reception and said Richard had been one of a kind. I said yes, he was. I meant it. Then I went home with my children, and we were quiet together for a long while, and that was right. 3 weeks later, a card arrived. Plain envelope, handwritten address, Gerald's handwriting on the front. Inside was a sympathy card, store-bought, with a printed verse about peace and remembrance. Gerald had signed his name beneath it, and below his name, in the same pen, he had added a note. The note said, "Eleanor, we should talk soon about the business. I think you'll want to hear what Richard promised me." I read it twice. I put it on the counter and stood there for a moment, looking at it. Gerald's handwriting was always a little uneven, slightly rushed, as if the thoughts were moving faster than the pen. Richard's handwriting had been the opposite, measured, clear, unhurried. I had seen both for 22 years, and I knew the difference between them as well as I knew my own. I made a cup of tea and stood at the window and looked out at the backyard for a while. The forsythia was starting to show color along the back fence, the yellow kind Richard had planted the second spring we were in that house. I thought about him planting it. I thought about what he would have said if he had read that card. Richard had been patient with Gerald in ways I had sometimes struggled to understand, but I do not believe he would have recognized the situation Gerald was describing, because it was not a situation that had ever existed. Then I put Gerald's card in the drawer. The drawer had been locked for a reason. Some people see a quiet woman and they assume she is not paying attention. They think the absence of noise means the absence of thought. They take her patience as proof that she does not fully understand what is happening, that she can be managed, that she will not know how to push back. I have found over 67 years that this assumption is almost always wrong, and that the people who make it tend to discover that quite late. Gerald was not the first person in my life to make that assumption. I grew up in a family where the women were expected to be gracious and accommodating and to keep the peace, even when the peace had been broken by someone else. I watched my mother do it. I watched her absorb situations that deserved a response and fold them neatly away because the alternative seemed like too much trouble. I understood that impulse, and I had spent the better part of my adult life deciding where I agreed with it and where I did not. Gerald, I believe, had filed me away in the category of women who could be waited out. Women who would eventually say yes because saying no required more energy than they had. He did not know me as well as he thought he did after 22 years, because what those 22 years had actually shown him was a woman being deliberately kind to him for someone else's sake. That is a different thing entirely. I contacted Patricia 3 days after Richard died. She had worked with Richard on his estate planning for years and knew his documents as well as I knew my own name. She was calm and methodical and had a particular impatience with what she called manufactured ambiguity. She was the right person for this, even before I knew exactly what this would become. I told Patricia about Carl's call, the questions Gerald had asked, the timing of it. She wrote it down. She said nothing dramatic. She just wrote it down. Over the weeks that followed, the estate was filed and the legal process moved the way legal processes move, which is to say, slowly and with a great deal of paperwork. I did what needed doing. I answered the questions that needed answers. I kept my records in order and I leaned on Patricia when I needed to, and I got up every morning and made tea and sat with the photograph on the kitchen table because I had moved it there after Richard died, to have something real to look at while I was working through things. Then, about 2 months after the estate was filed, Patricia called me on a Wednesday afternoon. Her voice had that particular quality it sometimes gets, careful and level and heading somewhere difficult. She told me Gerald's attorney had been in touch. She said there was a letter. She said she wanted to read it to me over the phone. She read the whole thing. I will not give you Gerald's exact words, but I will tell you what the letter said in substance. It was handwritten on plain paper, undated, no witness signature, no notary stamp, no letterhead of any kind. It was in Gerald's handwriting, he claimed, and it stated that Richard had verbally promised Gerald a controlling interest in the partnership business upon Richard's death in exchange for Gerald's early support in the partnership's founding years. The letter framed this as both a binding contract and a promise to be honored through the estate. It said Gerald was owed this not as a gift, but as the fulfillment of a commitment already made. Patricia read all of it, every sentence. When she finished, there was a short silence. Then I said, "All right." She waited a moment. Then she said, "Eleanor, I want to be very clear about what we are working with here. This letter has no date. It has no witness. It was never notarized. Under Virginia law, a handwritten letter of intent concerning a real property interest is unenforceable without proper consideration, a witness, and a notarized instrument. And no jurisdiction recognizes an informal letter as a codicil to a will without meeting statutory formalities. This letter meets none of those requirements, not one." I said I understood. She said Gerald's attorney had framed it in their communication as a simple matter of honoring a family agreement. I said, "It is not a simple matter, and it is not an agreement." Patricia said, "No, it is not." We laid out the next steps. The second paper told me more than the first. Patricia had done something I had not thought to do myself. She had requested the full correspondence history from Gerald's attorney, everything submitted in support of the claim. And buried in those documents was an exchange of emails between Gerald and a former associate of the partnership, a man who had left the business 7 years earlier on poor terms. Those emails went back 18 months, not to after Richard died, not to after Richard was diagnosed. 18 months back, meaning Gerald had been building toward this while Richard was still healthy, while none of us had any reason to think we were in the middle of a countdown. In those emails, Gerald had been asking questions about more than the partnership structure in general, about Richard specifically, about how decisions were made when a principal became incapacitated, about the transfer of equity interests, about what challenges such a claim might face, and how to frame it to look like something other than what it was. He had been preparing for at least 2 years. The letter was not a spontaneous act of grief. It was not something he had written in the raw, confused weeks after losing his brother. It was a plan, assembled quietly over time, and it had been started while Richard was alive and well and had no idea. I sat with that for several evenings. I did not talk about it much. I just sat with it. There is a particular kind of hurt that comes not from what someone does to you directly, but from understanding the full shape of what they had been doing when you were not watching. Gerald had sat at our holiday table. He had called Richard on his birthday for most of those 22 years, the kind of call that lasts 10 minutes and ends with everyone saying they should get together more. He had been at that wedding in 2002, visible in the background of the photograph I had looked at every morning since. He had shaken my hand at Richard's funeral and said Richard was one of a kind. And underneath all of it, going back at least 2 years before any of us had any reason to think about endings, he had been building a plan. I thought about all the dinners, the birthdays, the times Richard had stepped in with money when Gerald needed it. No paperwork, no conditions, just a brother helping a brother. I thought about Richard's generosity and how Gerald had apparently spent some of those years calculating what he was owed rather than being grateful for what he had been given. I did not know how to reconcile the Gerald who had sat at our table with the Gerald who had been sending emails about incapacitation clauses while Richard was still walking around healthy. I was not sure those were two different people. I took the wedding photograph off my dressing table and moved it to the kitchen table. Not to put it away. I needed it where I could see it clearly while I worked. I needed to remember Richard as he actually was, not as Gerald was describing him in a legal document. Richard was methodical and honest and genuinely generous and deeply fair. He had documented everything he meant because he understood that unwitnessed words are just air once the person who spoke them is gone. If he had genuinely promised Gerald anything of that magnitude, it would have been in writing. It would have been witnessed and notarized. It would have been reflected in the partnership agreement or in the will. It was in neither. Some people mistake softness for surrender. I want to be honest about what those months were like. There is a particular exhaustion that comes when grief gets interrupted by the necessity of defending yourself. You are already carrying the loss of the person you built your life around. You are already doing the daily work of learning how to be in the world without them. And then you also have to become the person who reads legal filings and keeps meticulous records and sits down with an attorney twice a week and has careful phone calls with accountants and former business associates. You have to do both at once. You do not get to grieve and then deal with the rest. It is all at the same time. I remember one evening when my daughter came to sit with me. She did not know the full extent of what Gerald was doing, only that there was a legal matter being handled. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and looked at the photograph and said, "Mom, you seem very calm about all of this." I told her that calm was what I had available and it would have to do. She reached over and put her hand on mine for a moment. Then we talked about other things. Her children, a show she had been watching, the forsythia coming back along the fence. That is what you do. You keep the ordinary things going alongside the difficult ones because that is the only way the difficult ones do not swallow everything. I got up every morning, I made my tea, I sat at the kitchen table with the photograph in front of me and the documents beside my coffee cup, and I read through things I had not looked at since the day they were signed. The partnership agreement, the will, the schedules and amendments, and years of correspondence. Richard had left everything in order, genuinely in order, not approximately. Every document said exactly what it needed to say, and nothing was missing. His equity interest in the partnership transferred to his estate according to the terms of the agreement. His estate distributed to me and our children according to the will. No gap, no ambiguity, no opening. Gerald could not name the specific consideration he claimed to have provided. When Patricia's team pressed him on this during the discovery process, the answer arrived in pieces and none of them added up to much. Early support in the letter turned out to mean attending some meetings in the first year of the partnership, introducing Richard to one contact who had not ultimately become a client, being generally available to talk through ideas by Gerald's own description. He had not invested money. He had not signed any formal agreement as a partner, contractor, or advisor. He had not been listed in any document from that period in any professional capacity. He had been the brother of one of the partners and had been present occasionally, the way family members sometimes are in the early, hopeful days of something new. In Virginia, a promise without genuine consideration is not enforceable. For a claim involving a real property interest, the law requires a written instrument that meets formal requirements, witnessed, notarized, clear and specific in its terms. Gerald's letter was none of those things. It was a wish committed to paper, framed in legal language by an attorney who had either not done her research or had decided to try anyway and see what happened. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in October. The night before, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. I had made tea and not drunk much of it. The house was quiet in the particular way houses get when you have lived in them long enough for the quiet to have texture. I could hear the refrigerator and the occasional sound of the neighborhood settling. I had the framed wedding photograph on the table in front of me, the one I had moved from the dressing table to the kitchen weeks ago. I looked at Richard's face. I looked at the way I was looking at him in the photograph, not at the camera, at him. And I thought about the fact that what was happening tomorrow was in some way Richard still doing what he had always done, protecting the people he loved by being thorough, by being careful, by trusting the right people and making sure everything was in writing. I did not feel nervous exactly. I felt something quieter than that, a kind of resolve that does not need much noise to maintain itself. Gerald called me the morning before the hearing. I was in my kitchen. The photograph was on the table where it had been for weeks. The October air was cool enough to justify cracking the window, and I had done that. The tea was hot. I saw Gerald's name on my phone, and I answered. He sounded confident. He said he wanted me to know there were no hard feelings on his side, that this was simply a matter of what Richard had intended, and that he felt sure the judge would see the full context once it was presented properly. He said he hoped the family could come through this without too much lasting damage. He said he had always respected me and that this was not personal. I listened to all of it. Then I said that I hoped he had a safe drive to the courthouse. I did not correct her. Not in that room. I set the phone down on the kitchen table. I looked at the photograph. The spring light of 2002, Richard and I together, and Gerald in the background holding his drink and watching. I had looked at that photograph on thousands of ordinary mornings and never studied Gerald's expression the way I studied it that morning. He had always looked like a man standing at the edge of something that was not his, waiting for a turn that was never going to come simply because he was waiting for it. I got dressed. I drove to the courthouse. I sat beside Patricia at the respondent's table, and I put my hands flat on the surface and I breathed. The room was quiet before the judge came in. Patricia had told me exactly what to expect, the sequence, what Gerald's attorney would argue, what she would argue in response. She had prepared for every version of this she could anticipate. I had read all of it. I understood the law as well as a non-attorney can understand it, which is to say, well enough. Gerald sat at the other table with his attorney. He was composed the way he always was when he needed to be, managing an impression. His attorney was confident in the particular way that does not always survive the actual hearing. The judge came in, the proceedings began. Patricia established the facts cleanly and without ceremony. She did not perform outrage. She did not editorialize. She laid out what the law required and she laid out what the letter provided, and the distance between those two things was so wide that by the time she finished, the judge had already done most of the work. The letter was undated, unwitnessed, not notarized. Under Virginia law, an informal handwritten letter cannot serve as a codicil to a will without meeting statutory formalities, none of which this letter met. It could not establish an enforceable contract for a real property interest without a written instrument meeting formal requirements, and it could not create a binding obligation without documented specific consideration from both parties. Patricia was thorough. She brought in the partnership agreement, which addressed the transfer of equity interests upon a partner's death in clear, specific language that had been agreed to by all parties years earlier. She brought in Richard's will, properly executed, properly witnessed, properly notarized, leaving no ambiguity about his intentions. She noted that Richard had had excellent legal counsel throughout the life of the business and had never, in any document or formal correspondence, mentioned Gerald in any capacity related to the partnership's equity. Gerald's attorney argued that the letter represented a private family agreement, the kind of promise that does not always make it into formal documents because it was made in the context of a trusting relationship. Patricia pointed out very calmly that Virginia law does not make exceptions to the formal requirements for real property interests on the basis of family trust. The law is the same whether the parties are strangers or brothers. Then Patricia asked Gerald, on the stand, to name the specific consideration he had provided in exchange for the alleged promise. He said he had given his brother early support. She asked him to be specific. He mentioned the meetings, the one contact who had not become a client, the conversations about ideas in the first year. She asked whether any of this was documented in any agreement between him and his brother at the time. He said they had not needed to document it. They were family. Patricia said, "And yet you have presented a letter to this court framing this as a formal promise. Was that promise ever documented in any signed witnessed instrument?" Gerald said the letter was the documentation. Patricia said, "The letter you produced, signed only by yourself, with no date, no witness, and no notarization, is your documentation of a promise your brother allegedly made to you." There was a pause. The judge looked at the letter. The judge looked at Gerald. Then the judge read the letter aloud, not a summary, the complete text. Every sentence in the flat, even voice judges use when they want nothing to be misunderstood or later disputed. The claim about early support, the claim about a controlling interest, the framing as both a binding contract and a promise to be honored through the estate, all of it. And then the judge came to the sentence near the end, the one Gerald had apparently included to soften the claim, to make it seem less like a demand and more like an acknowledgement of his brother's success. The sentence Gerald had added himself in his own handwriting. It said, "Richard's business acumen was always a little above what I could manage myself." The judge read it. Then the judge paused. I think Gerald had intended that sentence as humility. A younger brother acknowledging the older brother's talent, making the claim seem not like a grab, but like a tribute. Perhaps he thought it would earn him some goodwill from the bench. Whatever he had intended, what it sounded like when read aloud in a courtroom, in the middle of a probate proceeding, was the involuntary admission of a man who had always known he was not entitled to what he was claiming. Gerald's composure did not survive that sentence. He did not stand up or make a scene. He simply changed, the way a room changes when the light goes, something going still and flat behind his eyes. His attorney rested a hand near Gerald's arm on the table. Gerald did not move. The judge dismissed the claim, entirely, on every ground Patricia had raised. The letter was found to be unenforceable under Virginia law. It did not meet the requirements of any testamentary instrument. It did not establish a valid contract. The consideration claimed was vaguely described and wholly undocumented. The estate would proceed exactly as filed. It took fewer than 4 minutes after the arguments concluded. Patricia gathered her papers and said, "That is a clean result, which is about as close to celebration as Patricia gets." I said, "Yes, it is." I picked up my bag. I walked out of that courtroom with my back straight and my hands steady, and I did not look back at Gerald's table because I did not need to. Has a family member ever shown up after a loss claiming something was promised to them with nothing real to back it up? Drop your answer in the comments. I read everyone. The drive home was about 40 minutes. I put the classical station on, the one I always have on in the car. I thought about Richard, not about the hearing, just about him, about the fact that he had planned everything so carefully because he understood that love, the real kind, protects the people it leaves behind. He had not been careless with our life together. He had not been careless with any of it. And the fact that Gerald had come to that courtroom with a letter and a plan and a very confident attorney, and all of it had been dismantled by the documents Richard had properly executed years before any of this was necessary, that was Richard's last quiet gift to me. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just thorough and right and enough. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes before going inside. The October light was long and low in the way it gets in the afternoon, coming through the maples along the street at an angle that turns everything golden and a little blurry at the edges. I thought about the word careful, how Richard had been careful with money, careful with words, careful with people who deserved care and appropriately distant from people who did not. How the opposite of careful is not bold or brave. The opposite of careful is careless, and careless things eventually collapse under the weight of their own imprecision. Gerald had been careless with the truth, careless with his brother's memory, careless with what he could actually prove and what he had only imagined over years of watching that he deserved. And a courtroom is precisely the room where carelessness gets examined under steady, unforgiving light with nowhere left to hide. I got home. I unlocked the front door and stood in the hallway for a moment, the way you do when a house feels like itself again. Then I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table and I breathed for a while. Then I picked up the framed wedding photograph, the one I had moved to the table weeks ago, and I carried it back upstairs to my dressing table. That is where it lives. That is where it has always lived. I set it in its spot, and I looked at it for a moment. Richard and I in the spring light of 2002, and Gerald in the background, already watching, already holding his drink, and me in my mother's altered dress, not thinking about any of that at all, just looking at Richard, just beginning. I am not a woman who stays in crisis once the crisis is over. That took me a long time to learn, the permission to put the difficult thing down once it is resolved, to not carry it forward out of habit. Richard was gone, and what Gerald had done was done, and the court had done what courts are supposed to do, and now there was the rest of my life to get on with. I have 2 children who are good people. I have a house that knows me. I have a dressing table with a photograph on it and a garden with forsythia that comes back every spring because it was planted correctly the first time. I have the memory of a man who understood that the most important thing you can do for the people you love is make sure the paperwork is in order. That is not the most romantic thing anyone has ever said, but it is one of the truest. Gerald has not contacted me since the hearing. I do not expect him to. I think he understood, when the claim was dismissed in fewer than 4 minutes, that there was nothing left to say. Sometimes a silence is the most complete answer. I have thought more than once about what to call what Gerald did. Not the legal parts, I understand those clearly. I mean the personal part, the part where he decided that a widow's grief was an opening, where he sat down and wrote a letter and hired an attorney and brought it to a courtroom, claiming that 19 years of his brother's honest work was something he could take with a few sentences and a confident presentation, where he called me the morning before the hearing and told me he was sure the judge would see things his way, as if my patience with him over all those years was evidence that I did not understand what was happening. I think about the sentence the judge read last. Richard's business acumen was always a little above what I could manage myself. Gerald wrote that. He put it in his own letter, in his own hand, and he brought it to court. And sitting in that room, I understood something I had not quite articulated before. Gerald had always known. He had always known that what his brother built was beyond him, that it was not his, that no level of presence or proximity made it his. He had written it down himself without realizing what he was admitting. I have decided not to give that a name. It is what it is. Some people spend their lives watching other people build things and feeling owed a share simply because they were present, because they were nearby, because familiarity and proximity feel to certain minds like entitlement. I know who my husband was. I know what we built together. I know what was real and what was invented to fill a gap that Gerald had always felt but never found an honest way to close. A handwritten letter on plain paper is not a will. It is not a contract. It is not a promise with teeth. Under Virginia law, it is not even close to any of those things. And Richard knew that, which is why he never relied on conversations and intentions and informal understandings. He used attorneys and witnesses and properly executed instruments. He made sure that everything he meant was written down correctly because he understood that a promise only protects the person it was made to if it can be proven to exist. And if stories like this remind you that quiet dignity is not weakness, subscribe to my channel for more stories, because sometimes the softest voice leaves the deepest mark. The forsythia came back this spring, same yellow it always is along the back fence. I looked at it from the kitchen window one morning with my coffee, and I thought about Richard planting it in the second spring we were in that house, the way he dug the holes carefully and set the roots in properly and watered it until it took. He never rushed that kind of thing. He did it right the first time, and then he let it grow. That is what he gave me. It was more than the house and the children and the estate handled properly. He gave me the example of a person who does things right the first time, quietly, without needing anyone to watch, who understands that the careful, invisible work is the work that holds everything else up. The photograph is on the dressing table, the drawer is closed, the tea is hot. I am still here.